When we see too much sun chronically on the skin, what happens is you get that fissuring and cracking of the stratum corneum, so a lot of dry skin, easy fragility of the skin. The whole epidermis gets thinner, and that also contributes to the dermis. The blood vessels become more prominent as the dermis itself gets thinner with excess sun. And when the blood vessels become more prominent with a thin epidermis, you see a lot of bruising in individuals. The keratinocytes can become very atypical and form precancers we call actinic keratoses. They can also form different types of skin cancer, and the melanocytes can do the same in terms of turning into melanoma, but often will cause these sunspots that people commonly refer to as liver spots. They have nothing to do with the liver. They're sun-related brown spots that stay on the hands and face and neck, sun-exposed areas. In the dermis, we also see loss of collagen and elastin, so that's going to cause sagging and wrinkling of the skin. Now, in terms of the ultraviolet spectrum, it runs from 320 to 400 nanometers. The shortest wavelengths of light we see are the UVB rays, and they're actually very relevant. They really cause skin cancer and sunburn. They actually will penetrate the epidermis and the upper dermis, and they have both seasonal and daily variations. So we see higher intensity UVB in the mid part of the day, and also in the summer far more so than in other parts of the day, in the evening, and also in the winter where it's much less intense. It is mostly blocked by the ozone layer, so this is a big problem in areas of the world where there's thinning of the ozone layer near the polar caps, and we're seeing increased UV intensity and then a lot of increased skin cancer. Now with UVA, this is a more long wavelength light, and UVA has really come to be understood as a light that contributes to photoaging. It does have some very important contributions to skin cancer, and we found out a lot of this through tanning beds, which emit mostly UVA over UVB. UVA is also responsible for a lot of the photosensitive disorders we see. So if people have conditions like lupus, where they're sensitive to the sun, or they're on certain medications that make them sensitive to the sun, that's driven by UVA. It is not blocked by the ozone layer, and it does not have that seasonal or daily variation, so it's really a constant source of exposure. So we talked a little bit about what UV exposure does to the skin, and I'll focus on skin cancer, and this will lead in very well to what Dr. Most is going to talk to in terms of skin cancer treatment and facial rejuvenation. In the U.S., we have over 3.5 million skin cancers per year. Skin cancer is the most common cancer worldwide, and the non-melanoma skin cancer types are really the most prevalent. And those include basal cell carcinoma, where there's over at least 3 million cases in the U.S. We actually don't track these skin cancers in terms of the cancer registry systems because they tend to do quite well. They don't tend to cause death in patients, and so we don't know the exact number, but through Medicare billing and other thing, we have at least 3 million cases in the U.S. Squamous cell carcinoma is the next most common type of non-melanoma skin cancer with over 500,000 cases, and this has now become more of a problem in patients who are immunosuppressed from organ transplants, where we're actually seeing more aggressive squamous cell skin cancers that are spreading to other parts of the body and can actually have a fatal outcome. Melanoma is the most deadly type of skin cancer, even though it accounts for only about 4% of all skin cancers. It's about 80% of the deaths that we see. And in the U.S. this year, we'll have over about 130,000 cases of both the in situ and invasive cases of melanoma. 1 in 5 Americans will develop skin cancer. I've talked a little bit about the non-melanoma types and the fact that we really need to try to target melanoma prevention or early detection to try to cure patients with that disease. Now, what are we seeing in terms of young women? This is a Women's Health Forum, and I think this is something that we really need to know, particularly to educate not only ourselves as women, but daughters, relatives, nieces, and so on. What we're seeing, unfortunately, is a remarkable increase in cancer incidence, skin cancer incidence, both the non-melanoma and melanoma types in young women, women between the ages of 15 and 39. This has really been marked since 1990 on, and we're not seeing these same increases in young men. So when we take a look at the epidemiologic factors that contribute to this, it's not going to be something like genetic factors or host factors, and over such a short period of time we have to look at environmental factors. So the only thing that's really changed over this 30-year period is the use of tanning beds, which became prevalent from the mid-1980s on, and we think this is really causing this tremendous increase now in skin cancer rates in young women. So who gets skin cancer? Well, individuals who have the fairest skin are the ones who are most likely to incur that damage from the sun and then get skin cancer. And in dermatology and plastic surgery and head and neck surgery and so on, we look at skin type based on the amount of melanin that your skin has, and that's the pigment produced by your melanocytes, and then also the way your skin reacts to the sun. So we grade skin types from a type 1 person who is usually of Celtic origin, red hair, freckles, blue-green eyes, incredibly sun sensitive, all the way down to someone with very dark brown or black skin who's really never going to really experience sunburn and usually is deeply pigmented and will tan on top of it. Most Caucasians have type 2 or type 3 skin where they burn or tan moderately. So this is an individual young girl with type 1 skin, and there's just been a recent study that came out of Harvard that showed that the red pigment, which is called pheomelanin, it's one of the pigments that is made by your pigment cells, is itself a risk factor for melanoma, at least in mice. So red-headed individuals really need to sun protect. Now, in reality, we're actually seeing increased rates of skin cancer, both the melanomas and non-melanomas, also in darker skin individuals, skin types 4, 5, and 6. And in darker skin individuals, we tend to see less of the sun-exposed melanomas on the back and on the legs, but we will in turn see more melanomas on the palms, soles, and under the finger and toenails. So it's very important to look for pigmented lesions essentially all over the body. Just a few pictures of skin cancer, nothing too graphic. Basal cell skin cancer is friable and soft. It tends to bleed easily with rubbing, or if this is on a gentleman's face and he's shaving, it'll bleed and be a non-healing sore. So kind of non-healing sores in older individuals with lots of sun exposure on sun-exposed sites should be evaluated by a dermatologist or other practitioner. The squamous cell skin cancers are firmer in general, but they can still bleed like the basal cell carcinomas. These are actually not good locations for squamous cell carcinoma on the lip and on the ear. We see, again, a higher tendency for them to involve local lymph nodes, particularly in immunosuppressed patients. But if you have a non-healing sore or recognize one in a friend or relative, and I don't even care if it's a stranger, tell them to get it checked, because that's how we want to improve detection. Melanoma, I've kind of talked about the statistics. I'll kind of tell the most sobering one, which is that 1 person every hour in the U.S. passes away from metastatic melanoma that originated from the skin. And this, we think, is a largely preventable disease. So in terms of melanoma right now, it's the 5th most common cancer in men, the 7th in women. We see most individuals diagnosed around the age of 60, but it's the most common cancer in young women and second only to breast cancer in women in their early 30s. We try to educate practitioners and patients to recognize this disease when it's thin and curable, because the difference between a melanoma that's 1 millimeter in thickness on the skin has about a 97% 5-year survival. If that tumor is 4 millimeters in thickness, that survival drops to less than 50%. So we really want to detect these early. The ABCD warning signs talk about asymmetry of a brown lesion. The borders are irregular or notched. Colors are variegate, meaning you've got different shades of tan. You might even have a little pink, white, or red in there. The diameter can be bigger than a pencil eraser. It can also be smaller, but a growing or changing lesion should be evaluated. The problem with the ABCD criteria is they don't work for all melanomas. Some melanomas aren't brown, they're pink. And with the nodular subtype of melanoma, which I'll show you a picture of, we often don't see these characteristics. We see a lesion that grows up on the skin, that ulcerates and elevates and bleeds rather than does any of these. So for that reason, the American Academy of Dermatology added E to the ABCD mnemonic for any lesion that's changing over time. And then in Europe, they use, I think, a very helpful and easy mnemonic, the ugly duckling sign. The lesion that just doesn't match the other, it doesn't fit your profile of skin spots, have it looked at. So a couple melanoma subtypes. Superficial spreading is the most common subtype we see. We do see this mostly in our young age individuals. It tends to have those ABCD criteria. Lentigo malignant melanoma is a tough one in terms of local recurrence. Sam and I were just talking about cases of this where the margins around it are often positive. Sun-exposed sites, older individuals, but tends to also have those ABCD criteria. Nodular melanoma, I like to point this out. This is one of my patients with the Band-Aid sign. So again, these lesions, this is actually a pretty discrete lesion. There's some bleeding and crust. The patient thought it was an infected bug bite. It had stayed on the skin for 2 months. And by the time we pick these up, they tend to be thicker. So they're a tricky one to detect early. Acral lentiginous melanoma, again, something we need to point out in all races and ethnicities. This is the type we're seeing more so in darker skin individuals. So any kind of unusual pigmented banding in the toenails or fingernails or on the palms or soles. So we'll move into primary prevention, and what we really know in the skin cancer community is that if we were to practice aggressive sun protection in fair skin individuals worldwide, we'd probably prevent about 75% of all skin cancers, both the melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancer types. Most of an individual's sun exposure occurs in earlier childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, probably related to work habits after you finish college and so on. But this is something we need to really focus on, something we're even focusing on. You guys might have picked up the Sunsport pamphlet. We're trying to even talk to our college athletes to help them be ambassadors to younger age children, to get them to stop using, start using more sunscreen, practicing better sun protection, because we lose the sun protection message in individuals between the ages of 10 and 20. Now, what does sunscreen do? For the very first time, we've actually shown that primary prevention, meaning sun protection, here particularly sunscreen use, can reduce melanoma risk. And in this study, this was done in the early 90s for a period of 4 years, where individuals used just an SPF 17 sunscreen on commonly sun-exposed sites, so the face, the hands, the arms, and they found a 50% reduction in melanoma risk after 10 years of follow-up in those patients compared to the group that they also studied who had optional sunscreen use. So it's the first population-based prospective trial that really suggests that sunscreen can make a difference in preventing melanoma. Well, is tanning protective against melanoma? The short answer is no, no, and no. A tan means that your skin is being damaged by the sun. It actually is DNA damage happening right in front of your eyes, and it is your skin's way of protecting itself against sunburn. A tan gives your skin a little bit of an SPF, a sun protection factor, maybe 2 to 4, to prevent further sunburn, but it in no way is protective or good for you. We do recommend for individuals who are addicted to tanning or the color of being tanned, and there's a lot of literature to support that there's addictions to this behavior. We do recommend that they use the Sunless tanners, which contain a chemical called dihydroxyacetone. This is in the old QT formulation from the 70s, if anybody's old enough to remember it, but it's been much more elegantly manufactured since then, with producing very natural shades of tan and darker brown, depending on how dark you want to be. It just stains that stratum corneum, so it's not damaging the way your pigment cells, your melanocytes, produce melanin. So this is a very safe thing to use. What about tanning beds? They're bad news. They emit UVA 4 times stronger than natural sunlight and UVB 2 times stronger. They're poorly regulated, and I hope people are getting wind of the fact that the FDA is cracking down on tanning bed usage nationwide. California is only one of 2 states that has restricted tanning bed access to minors, and so we're hoping that there'll be national legislation that does this. The tanning beds most definitely double non-melanoma skin cancer rates and cause about a 75% increased risk of getting melanoma for individuals who've used tanning beds before the age of 35. And this is a new statistic we're really trying to tell our young patients about, young female patients in particular. Every time you use a sun bed, you're increasing your risk of melanoma about 1.8%. So we really have to try to dissuade people from going into the tanning and nail salon or tanning and hair salon, and stop getting the tanning bed usage. So there's no safe tan if it's achieved by either artificial light or natural sunlight. The artificial tanners are okay. And this brings up the whole facet of whether we can prevent sun damage and photoaging and how effective sunscreens are to do this. So sunscreens either absorb or reflect the harmful UV light, and they are namely a product that's been designed to prevent sunburn. Remember, sunburn is induced by ultraviolet B. So the SPF, or sun protection factor, some have suggested be renamed the sunburn protection factor, because that's what it's doing. And that's basically allowing you to maximize the dose that you spend in the sun with a sunscreen before your skin becomes red, i.e. sunburns, with the sunscreen compared to without. So it does increase the time that you can spend in the sun before your skin gets red. The problem is, once you hit that maximum dose for your individual skin type, you cannot add on more sunscreen to prevent the burn. You need to get out of the sun. So if you start feeling that pink, prickly feeling, time to get out of the sun. And we hope people don't wait that long anyway. The issue now with SPF is whether there is any value to labeling these at a much higher SPF beyond 50. And the FDA has actually done a great service in terms of really spending a lot of time over the last 5 years finalizing the sunscreen rules, and now having manufacturers comply by the end of 2013 of this year to come in line with what the products are really doing. Sunscreens will likely be capped at 50 plus in the near future. If you go to the store now, they're still not. You'll be able to find SPF up to 100 or so. And the reason for this is, if the sunscreen is properly applied, an SPF of 15 will block about 93% of ultraviolet B, an SPF of 30, 96%, and an SPF of 50, 98%. So it's not a linear relationship. You don't get double the sunscreen protection by using an SPF 30 over 15. You get a little more. The problem we see, though, is that consumers don't don't use enough sunscreen. They only put on about a quarter to a half of what they need to achieve the SPF the product is marketed for. And so for that reason, we'll say put on enough, number one, but usually go with an SPF 30 if you're going to be outside, because most people are just not putting on enough. The other thing the FDA has weighed in on strongly is that for a sunscreen to be called broad spectrum now, it has to not only protect against UVB, those shorter wavelengths of light, but the UVA as well. There are different sunscreen types, and this is always a big controversy, so I'll spend a little bit of time on this. Chemical sunscreens absorb UV radiation. There are a number of these. They are actually the organic sunscreens because they have organic chemicals in them. The physical sunscreens are the reflectors or scatterers of UV light. They are inorganic, based on inorganic pigments, and they've been much better in terms of the old traditional zinc oxide, which is obviously white and opaque. It's a very effective sun block, but now they're micronized in different formulations that are only more slightly opaque. The issue with all sunscreens is that there is no such thing as a total sun block, and so that term has been removed from the packaging. They'll all be called sunscreens. They all let sunlight through. In terms of the physical blockers, again, these are the inorganic sunscreens. They are these micronized particles of zinc oxide and titanium dioxide. On their own, they do not go into the far UVA spectrum. So while the physical sunblocks are often very helpful for people who might be allergic to some of the chemicals in the chemical sunscreens, they traditionally do not block all the way into UVA, so they usually have additives in terms of chemicals to now be labeled broad spectrum. There are better ones in development in Europe, and Australia and Japan. The European Union have much better sunscreens than the US, and so hopefully this one will make it to the US, the Optizol, in the future. Broad spectrum, again, has to filter both UVB and UVA. In the U.S., the traditional, or now the best UVA filter we have is avobenzone. It used to be called Parsol 1789. It is a long UVA wave filter. It'll go all the way to the 400 nanometers. The problem, though, is that it breaks down in the sun, making it essentially useless, and so it has to be stabilized with other UV filters. And in the U.S. now, all avobenzone-containing products over the last 2 years have to now have octocrylene in them. And if they don't have octocrylene in them, they can't call themselves broad spectrum. So you don't have to worry about this anymore. With sunscreen manufacturing changes in the last 2 years, this is the truth. The issue is that we have better sunscreens available if you want to try to get these from other countries. I love Tynazorb. Tynazorb goes into the far UVA spectrum. It doesn't cause irritation. It has no safety issues that even the Environmental Working Group is worried about. And it is more expensive, though, about $25 a bottle. So that, I hope, makes it to the U.S. market soon. And there's some other ones I'm happy to talk about. Sunscreen safety, just to mention, the Environmental Working Group has brought up some concerns regarding oxybenzone, retinol palmitate, the parabens, and titanium dioxide. The FDA has strongly refuted these claims. Most are based on lab models where animals receive over thousands of times greater exposure than a human would. In other words, these animals have these ingredients injected into their bloodstream, or they're ingesting it, and that's not the way we use sunscreen. I mean, the skin is a great barrier. Nothing gets through it, including nano-sized particles. Parabens are in over 90% of cosmetic products. Vitamin A derivatives, which is the retinol palmitate, actually are used to prevent skin cancer. They don't cause it, and there's no evidence to support hormone disruption. So the FDA doesn't question the safety of any of the ingredients in currently marketed sunscreens in the U.S. And so if you get on the website of the EWG, you'll be listing certain ones that are unsafe, and I think that those are largely baseless claims. There really is no controversy over the efficacy of sunscreen. It's safe and effective against preventing sunburn, skin cancers, both the non-melanoma and melanoma types. But we also do recommend that sunscreen be used as an adjunct to other photoprotective measures, your hat, your protective eyewear, and protective clothing, which is also a very good way to protect your skin from the sun. Waterproof, the term's been abandoned by the FDA. We now use either water-resistant or very water-resistant, depending on whether the product will maintain its SPF after 40 versus 80 minutes of immersion in water. So that's coming up as a new labeling. How to use sunscreen, most of this is intuitive. I'll just point out a few things. 2 to 3 tablespoons for the entire body, 1 teaspoon to the face. That's why we're saying most people don't put this amount on. This is a shot glass worth. So think about that the next time you put sunscreen on, or see your children or spouse or partner put it on. People just put on a little bit on a few areas. No one's putting on what they need. You do have to reapply it every 2 hours. The sunscreen efficacy wanes after about 2 hours. Certainly if you're swimming or having any kind of heavy sweating, it's going to kind of wash off. Prolonged heat will degrade sunscreen, so go figure you've got these bottles that are sitting out in the sun, and if they start to turn yellow, the sunscreen, throw it out and get a new one. Sunscreen also has an expiration date, so check the expiration date about every 2 years, toss your sunscreen out and get new ones, but the expiration date's on there. I have to mention Consumer Reports Sunscreen Testing. I don't have the 2013 data, but they traditionally test all of these over-the-counter sunscreens for, and over the cosmetic counter as well, for broad spectrum activity, water resistance, staining of clothes, etc. And what they always find is that the cheapest sunscreens outscore the most expensive products. Price has nothing to do with performance. So I had a slide with the list of the ones they like. You can Google this. The 2013 ones you have to have a subscription to Consumer Reports to get. But they will talk about Best Buys ones. You're talking about the Banana Boats and the Copper Tones and the Neutrogenas. These are all good sunscreens. So find a product that you like. If you're dealing with children and adolescents, get one that won't cause acne. If you're dealing with scalp issues, you might use a spray, but don't spray the face. You can spray the scalp or spray your hand. Find one that you might use a couple different varieties depending on what you're doing that day, if you're out at a swim meet versus if you're just walking to and from work. Future directions, antioxidants added to the sunscreens, either topically and systemically to help with photo repair. New absorbers I've talked about. This is my very favorite Tinosorm, and we are done. We're not going to do this. This I hope we do soon. Sunscreen in the bathrooms, SPF 30. This is the Desert Museum. This is in the women's bathroom. I sent my husband to look in the men's bathroom. I'm sure it was untouched, but this is in there. And then skin cancer screening is coming up. Flyers are outside. So sorry if I went over sales.
I'm just going to close this up. Is that okay?